The last major topic for the course is a topic called ecology. And ecology is the study of interactions between different species on Earth and between living things and their non-living environment. Now, ecology is actually kind of a natural growth of the understanding of the theory of evolution. Because remember, in the theory of evolution, Darwin proposed the idea that whether species continue or go extinct, whether individuals survive or not, is primarily due to how good the match is between their physical traits and the environment they live in. So once biologists started to accept that Darwinian idea of species changing when their environment changes, they realized that looking at the environment and studying environmental impacts on species is a very, very important area of research for basically seeing how healthy a species is and how likely it is to continue into the future. So in the early 1900s, this new biological field of ecology was created to study interactions between different species that lived in the same area and between living things and the non-living parts of their environment. So non-living portions of the environment include things like air and water and soil to some extent, um, space, temperature, light. Those are non-living components of the environment, but they're still obviously very important to living things. All living things have a certain range of conditions that they can survive in, and if the conditions gets too extreme, they can't survive. But also all living things interact with other living things in their environment. There's two major kinds of interactions between living things in the environment. One is called predation and the other is called symbiosis. And we're going to be talking about those two in this lecture segment. Now, these are interactions that don't involve the non-living world. These are just interactions between different species, different living species, that happen to live in the same area. Predation was the first form of ecological interaction studied. It's obviously pretty important to a species if there are other species around it that can eat it, that use it as food. It's also very important to a species to be able to find food, to find other things to eat, usually other living things. So predation is basically the study of who eats who. So which critters in an environment consume which other critters for nourishment. Keep in mind that most living things have to consume parts of other living things in order to survive. Virtually everything you eat was once part of another living thing, although our human food tends to be so heavily processed in this country that by the time you eat it, it doesn't really look like what it was. But once upon a time, it was part of another living thing or part of several other living things. Parts of plants, parts of animals, that's what we consume. Parts of other life. So ecologists were interested because they knew it was important for the survival of a species, whether there was prey available to it, things it could eat, and whether there were predators in the vicinity that could eat it. So that's an important part of survival for most species. And so the first form of interaction that ecologists studied was actually predation interactions. And they would do that just by sending people out into the field, out into various areas. And there was a lot of observation involved, just looking around and seeing, you'd have to sit still and be a quiet observer in an area to see the critters and their interactions. It also involved collecting specimens and analyzing the specimens. For example, they would trap animals in the vicinity, the early ecologists, and then they would dissect them and open up their stomachs to look at their stomach contents to see what they ate. Or they would analyze their poop. They would find their poop and analyze that to see what was in their diets. So predation, the study of which critters eat which others, and as ecologists were studying predation, they realized that they could divide up pretty much all living things on Earth into 5 basic feeding groups. So they divided every living thing on Earth into 5 groups based on what they ate. Now, some of the names that the ecologist invented are fairly famous, and I bet you've heard of a number of these. For example, carnivore, herbivore, omnivore, those are words you may have heard before. Vore is Latin for to eat. Herbivore, these are vegetarian animals here in this group. They're animal forms or protozoan that only eat plant material or algae. Then there's carnivore, and if you speak Spanish, you know the word carne means meat. Carnivores are animals that have to eat parts of other animals in order to survive. By the way, carnivore doesn't mean it only eats meat. Carnivore just means it has to eat meat in order to live. But a lot of carnivores, as we'll see in a minute, they do actually eat plants sometimes. That doesn't make them not a carnivore. But they can't survive on plants. They can't live as vegetarians. So carnivores are animals that have to eat some other animal parts to live. Herbivores are vegetarian animals. Omnivores, the word omni in Latin means every, and omnivores are animals that pretty much can eat anything. So usually part of their diet consists of plants or algae, and part consists of parts of other animals, parts of carnivores, parts of herbivores. Omnivores, though, are different than carnivores in that omnivores actually can live as vegetarians. So if there's no meat available, or sometimes by choice, omnivores may actually not ever eat other parts of other animals. They may only eat plants or algae. So carnivores cannot live as vegetarians. They can't live like herbivores, but omnivores actually can live like herbivores, although they usually choose not to. Herbivores can only live like herbivores. So if you think about some examples of these types of animals, examples of herbivores you're probably familiar with. A lot of our food animals are herbivores, and interestingly, most of the largest animals on Earth are herbivores. So, for example, giraffes, the tallest land animal, elephants, one of the biggest land animals, hippos, horses, zebras, those are all herbivores. It's interesting that these vegetarian animals tend to get bigger than animals that actually eat parts of other animals. So clearly, a vegetarian diet doesn't stop you from building muscle and gaining size. Examples of carnivores, and this may surprise you, are your cat or dog that you have at home. All cats and all forms of cat, and all dogs and all forms of dog, and all near dog relatives, they're all carnivores. So wolves are carnivores, coyotes are carnivores, dogs are carnivores, cats are carnivores, so are lions, cheetahs, leopards. So all the cat and dog family groups are carnivores. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I've got my dog at home and I sometimes see him eat grass or apples or whatever. And that doesn't make him not a carnivore. Remember, carnivores do sometimes eat plant materials. That doesn't make them not a carnivore. What makes dogs and cats not a carnivore, not an omnivore, is that they have to eat some meat to survive. If you feed a dog or cat a completely vegetarian diet, they'll die, usually within about 6 to 8 weeks. They just can't, their intestinal systems, their digestive systems are not designed to break down plant material efficiently. So if you just feed them a lot of plant stuff, their intestines get clogged up and blocked, and they don't get enough energy. They can't absorb enough of the nutrient. But that doesn't mean they never eat plants. You'll see cats eat grass, you'll see dogs eat all kinds of plant material. But ultimately, they do have to have meat or they're going to die. Omnivores go both ways. They can go either way. They can live as vegetarians or not. Um, and that makes them quite adaptable to different environments on Earth because regardless of what critters are around, they can usually find something to eat. The ultimate omnivore on Earth is humans. We are the ultimate omnivore. We can eat at least parts of most animals and plants that are on Earth, and also, of course, what's in the sea. So we have quite the varied diet, and that's helped us survive in all different environments on Earth, because wherever we go, we can find things to eat. Now, the other two groups, which you may never have heard the technical names for, the group that's called producers. And this group down here, this consists of plants and algae. And I don't know if you remember what plants and algae have in common. I'll give you a minute on that one. You remember what plants and algae can both do that no other critters can do? Well, hopefully you thought of the word photosynthesis. Plants and algae do photosynthesis, which means they can build their own food from carbon dioxide gas, water, and light. So they don't directly have to eat other critters. They get eaten by a lot of critters, by herbivores, by omnivores, even by carnivores sometimes. But they don't have to eat other critters directly in order to survive. They can build sugar, build food from gas, water, and light. And as we'll see in a minute, also some minerals in the soil. So they call the producers because they actually create the food ultimately that all these other critters eat. Herbivores only eat producers, and so producers essentially are producing all the food, not just for them, but for the herbivores too. And then herbivores are food for carnivores and omnivores. So indirectly now, the producers have produced the food for all of these groups. If you take away the producers from an area, then the food web no longer exists because soon you will lose all these other groups as they would have nothing to consume. Another group is decomposers, and that's a group you may not be very familiar with. Decomposers, which are also called detritivores, they don't eat anything living. They don't catch food. They wait for living things to die and eat the dead tissue. They consume the dead tissue, or they consume the waste, like the poop left over by living animals. So decomposers and detritivores, they will all eat, they will all wait for these other critters to die and then consume them after they die, or they will wait for them to release waste and then consume their waste. Decomposers actually have an extremely important function in the food web because they recycle the nutrients that would otherwise be trapped in the bodies of these dead animals and plants. When animals and plants die outside, if nothing were to break them down, then all of the chemicals that they absorbed and converted into their tissues would be lost essentially to the ecosystem, and that would be a horrible waste of energy. So what decomposers do is they break down the proteins, the DNA, the nucleic acids of these critters, and they break down the starches and all the other parts of the tissues of these critters after they die. And some of that, of course, energy that they get from that, they use themselves for their own growth and reproduction. But some of it they break down and then release into the environment. They don't use it themselves, but they release it. For example, the nitrogen that's in amino acids and the nitrogen and phosphorus that's in DNA and RNA that's trapped in the bodies of these critters when they die, the decomposers actually break those, the DNA and the proteins down and convert some of that nitrogen and phosphorus into nitrate salts and phosphate salts, which they then release back into the environment as salts. These are now mineral salts in the environment. And turns out that these salts are necessary for the growth of producers. Producers have to absorb those salts in order to keep growing and keep reproducing. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute.